So you're involved in a discussion with somebody in which you have a fierce debate, in which both of you believe very strongly about whatever side it is that you are arguing. One person claims one thing, you claim another, and it appears that you have a kind of intractable disagreement. If both of you have goodwill, here's my suggestion. If both of you have goodwill, you will both find a way to come to a conclusion that perhaps not both of you will entirely agree with, but at least you will respect each other, knowing that the reasons for whatever claim it is that you're making is solid, is sound, is reasonable, is not fraught with all kinds of errors and all kinds of fallacies, ending up being what somebody might call ridiculous or stupid or absurd. So the point of this lecture actually is to talk about what are some of the fallacies, what are some of the things that people use sometimes, we all do it, in our reasoning that gets in the way of clear-headed thinking. Remember that one of the definitions of philosophy, as I gave to you, was this unusually stubborn attempt to think clearly. I'm going to add to that. It's also an unusually stubborn attempt to think well, to think in a way that is sound and solid. If all people are thinking well, and maybe you don't agree with this, but I'm going to argue that if all people are thinking well, we will find that we have more agreement than disagreement around very important matters. Now, you've already seen that there are a variety of types of arguments that people can use when they're trying to make their point. So people can use what's known as a deductive logical argument, and those arguments, as you saw, are more frequently made in areas such as mathematics or in some rather basic areas. There's that other kind of reasoning, which is actually the kind of reasoning that we use more often. So we shouldn't look down on it and say, oh, it's insufficient or not solid enough. Inductive logical reasoning is what we use throughout most of our lives. Inductive logical reasoning is the reason why you believe that your car is still out in the parking lot if you happen to drive to class today. Inductive logical reasoning, as you'll see throughout this course, is something that we use not only in areas such as ethics, but even in common sense areas of our lives every day throughout the day. The challenge becomes making sure that we construct our arguments on solid premises, on a factual basis as much as that is possible, and that we construct our arguments in such a way that the conclusions can be seen as persuasive, as cogent, as something that any reasonable person would expect, or that any reasonable person at the very least could come to agree with. So let's take a look at some of these common fallacies. And what I would encourage you to do as I go through this is to think about examples. Think about perhaps times in which you've used some of these fallacies in your own reasoning, and also when you've heard others use it. Watch the news and pay attention to how various points are argued. If you participate in online forums, that's a perfect place to identify where you see tons and tons of fallacies that end up being used. The ad hominem one, I would suggest, being used the most. So the first distinction that we need to make before we actually get into the various types of fallacies is the distinction between formal fallacies versus informal fallacies. As you can see in your text, formal fallacies have to do with the structure of an argument. And so they're really dealing with how one premise flows one to another, whereas an informal fallacy has to do with the content or the wording of the argument. These various fallacies that we're going to look at really deal with informal fallacies. In other words, the structure of the argument in terms of what the premises are and how they flow one to another is not necessarily what we look at here. What we're looking at is the types of premises that a person actually uses. So, what are the foundations upon which the argument in fact builds? The fallacy known as hasty generalization deals with generalizing from unrepresentative and insufficient cases. So what it means is that a person makes a claim, and yet the evidence for that claim is minuscule. It doesn't really represent all of the cases, and therefore the claim cannot be considered to be true. This is also known as a glittering generality, because if you think about it, a person is just making this kind of glittering statement and they're believing that that covers all cases. It's an important fallacy to be on guard against, Because very often people will make a claim, and yet if you really stop and ask them for their evidence, they will appeal to one particular story, one particular anecdote, or one particular set of data. This does not ensure that their argument, in fact, is true. Here is an example of a hasty generalization. You have heard perhaps sometimes people will say something like, some men, they behave just like pigs. And then they'll also say that because of that, because some men behave like pigs, or some people in a particular demographic behave a certain way, then therefore all people who belong to that particular group, they must all behave the same way. So if some men behave like pigs, therefore all men are pigs. If some people who belong to a particular group, they behave a certain way, and by the way, I saw people when I was in the store and they were acting this way, this means that all people who belong to that particular group, maybe it's in accordance with race or whatever it happens to be, then all people who belong to that same group, they must all be the same way. You can think about how absolutely horrible that way of reasoning is, to lump everyone together in a group, to lump anything together in a group, and then make a universal claim about that group. It's very poor reasoning. The next fallacy is referred to as begging the question. This fallacy occurs when someone's reason is resting on an assumption, and it is that assumption that in fact they are trying to prove. For this reason, this is also known as a circular argument. If you think about a circle, it starts in one place and then it comes around to the very same place. The argument in this instance does the same exact thing. It starts in one place with something that is essentially an assumption, and then tries to prove that assumption based on its own assumption. So let's look at the following example. There are many corrupt senators because many senators break the law, and the reason so many senators break the law is that they are corrupt. You can see the circle within this claim that is just made. Why is this a fallacy? Because a statement cannot prove itself. A premise must have a different source of reason, ground, or evidence from its truth. And it's only from that evidence that builds on each other, essentially, that the conclusion may be reached. Just for fun, let's go ahead and combine this fallacy, so begging the question, with the previous fallacy that we discussed, which was hasty generalization. So we'll change our statement so that it actually says that senators are corrupt because they break the law, and the reason so many senators break the law is that they are corrupt. Now notice what has changed in this particular statement is that it is saying that senators are corrupt, not that some are corrupt, but that all senators are corrupt because they break the law. And then the reason why so many of them break the law is because all senators are corrupt. In distinction to the previous example where it said there are many corrupt senators because they break the law, all we had to do is change our statement so that it also is a hasty generalization by referring to everyone. I bring this to your attention because I want you to be on guard that sometimes there may be multiple fallacies within the same argument. So just because you diagnose that the fallacy is a begging the question fallacy, that doesn't mean that there aren't others as well. Some of the others that I will be talking about momentarily, as well as some other ones that I am not covering within this lecture. A third fallacy is known as the black and white fallacy. This type of faulty reasoning occurs when someone falsely limits the alternatives in an argument. For that reason, it is also known as a false dichotomy. Essentially what it does is it sets up that there are only two options. So in my example here, the first premise is, to have better schools, you must raise taxes. The second premise, you won't raise taxes, and therefore, indisputably, you will not have better schools. Well, think about all of the alternatives. If what you seek is the conclusion to have better schools, are there other ways to do it other than raise taxes? Raising taxes may be a part of it, but those are not the only alternatives. By limiting the alternatives, one fails to see the entire scope of a particular situation or of a particular matter. Here is a fallacy that is very common, particularly among people who are not listening to each other. It's known as the Strawperson fallacy, and it deals with the misconstruing of the argument of one's opponent and really refuting the misconstrual rather than the actual argument. Oftentimes when people are arguing, they are not paying close attention to what the other person is actually trying to say, or they are not using their analytical skills to truly understand where the other person is coming from. So here's the way this particular fallacy works. Person 1 makes a claim. We'll call that Y. Person 2 restates person 1's claim, but they do it in a distorted way. Maybe they will not necessarily restate that person's claim verbally, but at least inside themselves, in terms of how they are processing it, it is distorted. It is not actually what person 1 was saying. A way to avoid this fallacy is in step 2, in restating the claim, ensure that one is actually restating it accurately. Let the other person clarify if needed. But when that doesn't happen, as you can see in step 3, person 2 then attacks the distorted version of the claim. And in attacking the distorted version of the claim, they say, therefore, whatever the claim is, claim Y, is false. So here's one example that you might be familiar with. Somebody says, do you believe in evolution? And another person says, yes, I do. And then the person automatically jumps to a claim, oh, so you think we're just more evolved from apes. In saying that a person believes in evolution, they are not necessarily saying that we are just more evolved apes. You can even see how some black and white reasoning is being used in this particular fallacy. Very often, when we are trying to argue a point, we tend to use analogies. That is, we tend to compare one thing to another, and then based on the strength of that comparison, we arrive at a conclusion. If one thing is very much like another thing, then we can say that it is probably more true that whatever claim it is that we are making is true, because after all, it's just like the thing we compared it to. However, this can lead us to a fallacy known as the false analogy fallacy. This is a common type of fallacy in which the alleged similarities either do not hold or are not even relevant to the conclusion. Perhaps the best way to understand this fallacy is to look at the two examples that I have provided here. In the first example, you will notice that it states that people who are addicted to coffee are no different than alcoholics. And so what it is essentially doing is it is comparing the addiction to coffee with the addiction to alcohol. Now, while there may be some similarities, there are also some profound dissimilarities. And so one really cannot say that a person who is addicted to coffee is the same as an alcoholic. If they wish to elucidate what those similarities are, they may do that in the argument. However, they should also, if they're being truly intellectually honest, they should highlight what those dissimilarities are and what their implications are. If you look at my second example there, it states that public schools have done very well, so the problems of public schools today, lack of achievement, lack of discipline, are due to ineffective teachers. So there are multiple problems with this argument. One of them has to do with the fact that when it says that public schools have done very well, it does not specify when. So we don't even know what the basis of comparison is. Are we comparing schools of 100 years ago, of 50 years ago, of 20 years ago? So we don't even know what the comparison truly is. But if we look back and we say, okay, we'll specify, the schools back in the 1930s did very well. Now all of a sudden it's saying the problems of public schools today, so it's assuming that there are problems with public schools today, which it would need to give evidence of. But it says that automatically it's due to ineffective teachers. Do we know for a fact that teachers today are any less effective than teachers back in the 1930s? What are they ineffective at? What are some of the other structural changes that have occurred in schools beyond how teaching is done? None of this is specified in the argument, and hence the analogy between schools of whatever time period and schools of today does not hold. This argument not only is using a false analogy, particularly in its lack of specificity, but it is also using a hasty generalization due to generalizing that all schools have ineffective teachers and are not doing well. And moreover, in its lack of precision, it's not even identifying what does it mean for a school to do well. Does that mean that a school does very well in teaching mathematics, in teaching English, in teaching critical thinking? None of that is specified here. So the analogy has no true rational foundation in this argument. If this is going to be a persuasive argument, much needs to be added. The analogy must be built, it must be constructed along lines of solid evidence. The final type of fallacy that I'm going to treat in this podcast is known as the ad hominem fallacy. This fallacy involves someone trying to undermine someone else's claim by calling attention to irrelevant personal characteristics. I'm going to suggest that this type of argumentation is typically made out of desperation, that the person who is arguing against a point, rather than actually arguing against the rational points, finds it easier to go after the messenger, so to speak, the person who is actually making the argument with which they disagree. While there may be relevant characteristics of a person making an argument that actually condition how well or less well we take the argument itself, attacking that person's personal characteristics oftentimes is not necessarily rooted in facts. So here's the way that this argument works. The first person makes a claim. The second person calls the person stupid or a moron or that they don't know anything, and as a result of solely that idea that the person making the argument doesn't have credibility, the argument is deemed to be false. Maybe a good way to understand this is by looking at the following argument. So if I say 87,575 people live in Reading, Pennsylvania, and another person, let's call him John, says, "You're an idiot." The conclusion is then drawn that the claim that 87,575 people living in Reading, Pennsylvania is false. But actually we know from the data that is not false. And while the person making the argument could be an idiot, that is not what makes the argument false. Now I want to throw in a caveat to this, because oftentimes we do have to consider the credibility of a person who is making a claim. If you know, for example, that someone lies all the time, then you probably wouldn't put much stock in a claim that they're making. The important distinction is to say that I'm not going to put stock in the claim that they're making, not so much because they are a liar, it may make me more suspicious, but because I have factual evidence to the contrary. Factual evidence is key. We cannot determine the strength of an argument solely on the person who is giving the argument. We must always look at the facts behind the argument. The final point in this podcast is I do want to point out that there are other kinds of fallacies that people will use. I'm not going to go into them in this particular podcast. However, please be aware that there are fallacies known as the red herring fallacy, as equivocation, false cause, genetic, slippery slope, appeal to the people, and appeal to emotion. These are rather important fallacies, and I invite you to look them up to familiarize yourself with what these fallacies are and how they are oftentimes used. The more we point out fallacious reasoning, the more we are able to clarify reasoning, not only for ourselves but also for others. I strongly suggest that without clear reasoning, we do not have constructive argumentation. None of our discussions can go anywhere with each other when we are not thinking clearly. We want to isolate what kind of reasoning we are using, whether that is deductive or inductive, the strength of that reasoning, and if that reasoning relies on premises that are faulty to begin with.